Hi, good morning, everyone. And thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to YWBoston's 2020 Elevating Lives series. I'm Beth Chandler, YW's President and CEO, and I'm thrilled to say thank you for joining us for our second and final event of the series, The Future of DEI, How to Sustain Organizational Change. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that YWBoston headquarters, as well as many of our staff working from home, reside on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people, past and present. I recognize this fact to pay respects to the people who stewarded this land and to remind all of us here today to be intentional about the use of native lands. As the first YWCA in the nation, YWBoston has been at the forefront of advancing equity for over 150 years. Through our DE&I services, InclusionBoston and LeadBoston, as well as our advocacy work and FIRE initiative, we help individuals and organizations change policies, practices, and behaviors with a goal of creating more inclusive environments where women, people of color, and especially women of color can thrive. During the current pandemic, we are helping organizations strengthen social connections to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion in the virtual space, as well as in their reopening plans to ensure more equitable outcomes moving forward. Each year, we bring together top diversity, equity, and inclusion experts for our Elevating Lives series. Back in the summer, when we began planning this year's event, we were immersed in a moment unlike any I had ever experienced before. It had become clear that COVID-19 was not the democratizing virus many people believed it to be, with its disparate impact on women, people of color, and especially women of color, and an unprecedented number of organizations, large and small, were releasing public statements condemning racism and promising action in support of Black Lives Matter and social justice. From June until now, our team at YWBoston has been working with organizations who know they must transform their words into action. It has made us think hard about what it means to hold ourselves and our institutions accountable to our promises of action and change. That led us to this year's theme, Elevating Lives 2020, Delivering on Promises of Racial Justice. Our first event, held in November, examined the impacts of COVID-19 on caregivers, especially women and women of color. Our panel of experts discussed the challenges women and caregivers faced prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, how they have been exacerbated in 2020, and the actions leaders must commit to in order to rectify this childcare crisis. Today's events look at how organizations can follow through on their public statements in support of racial equity. In early June, we mourned the loss of many Black lives to anti-Black racism, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others known and unknown. I was proud to stand among my fellow Bostonians as we called for accountability and racial equity within our institutions. We recognized we could not go back to the status quo, a status quo which systematically harms Black Americans. Many people learned or were reminded that we cannot look away from justice. We all must do our part to dismantle racism. And more than ever before, our institutions began to listen. Organizations that had never publicly commented on institutional racism began to release statements of their solidarity and commitment to action. And in Boston, systemic racism was finally named for what it is, a public health crisis. My guess is that many of you in the audience work at organizations that issued a statement, either externally or internally. I believe that these statements are impactful. They encourage organizations to learn from one another and recognize their responsibility to equity and inclusion. As a result, we partnered with King Boston to learn more about these organizations' impact. The Equity Statement Project seeks to collect and archive equity statements for reflection, analysis, critique, and posterity. If you'd like to contribute a racial equity statement to King Boston's research efforts, please send it to data@kingboston.org. We at YW Boston have had the honor of working with many organizations looking to deepen their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, we saw a dramatic increase of interest in our Inclusion Boston program. Through Inclusion Boston, we have engaged with these organizations in long-term partnerships to assist them in creating necessary cultural shifts that support inclusive policies and practices. It has now been 6 months since we saw this boom of support for racial equity. Whether your organization has followed up on their statement with action or not, you may be wondering what's next. Well, it is up to all of us as leaders of these organizations and as the people who utilize their services to encourage accountability. We need to sustain our energy in order to address deeply entrenched inequities in our communities, systems, and institutions. Which brings us to today's event. Together, we will learn concrete ways our organization can deliver on the commitments made and sustain long-term change. We will be joined by John Hancock President and CEO, Marianne Harrison, and McKinsey Company partner, Sara Prince. Both Marianne and Sara have extensive knowledge about the positive impact DEI work can have on an organization. They will share how they are holding themselves accountable and how they manage to successfully turn aspirational social justice statements into concrete plans for more equitable organizational change. Thank you to everyone who is supporting this event today, our speakers, our sponsors, including our gold sponsor, Arbella Insurance, and all of you who are learning with us today. It is also thanks to our donors that we are able to host events such as this one, as well as carry out our mission to eliminate racism and empower women. Many of you have already given to us by sponsoring the series or buying a ticket, and we are so grateful for that. And if you feel so inclined, we would greatly appreciate your financial support. Our QR code at the bottom right corner of your screen will take you directly to our donate page, or you can text donate to 617-652-5008 to make a gift from your phone. Bringing more people into the conversation is a key part of our work at YW Boston. I ask that you engage those who are not here today by spreading the word on social media. If a particular statistic shocks you or you hear a helpful piece of advice from a panelist, I encourage you to share it on social media. Remember to tag at YW Boston and use the hashtag ElevatingLives2020. Now, I would like to turn the screen over to Sara Prince, who will provide further context for our discussion. Sara is a partner at McKinsey Company and co-authored McKinsey's groundbreaking report, Diversity Matters. We first welcomed Sara to discuss the relationship between diversity and financial performance at our 2018 Elevating Lives event, Diversity, the Value Side of the Equation. Back in 2018, we were thrilled to have her fly up from Atlanta to join us. Today's virtual journey doesn't take quite as much time for travel, but we are no less excited to learn from her. Please join me in welcoming Sara Prince.
Thank you so much, Beth. I am very excited to be back with the group and to really dive into today's conversation. I think in particular, as we all experience the events over the spring and summer, struck by one that while there was broad national attention brought to them, obviously these are things that were happening in communities in pervasive ways for quite some time. But to this moment of organizations really taking the charge to lean in and to not only issue equity statements, but also to go beyond that. And so I thought I'd frame our conversation for just a few minutes today with a little bit of the latest and greatest research on what we're seeing in terms of the business relationship with diversity and inclusion, but more so as organizations are really leaning in, how are we seeing that evolve? And then, hopefully that sets a little bit of interesting background context for the broader discussion we'll have. So I will get us over here to the content. All right, hopefully everyone can see the screen. If not, if someone will just give me a shout. So as we go into this, I think it's important, interesting, just 2 years ago when we had this conversation, I was making a point of talking about inclusion and diversity, but really the reason for that was to put the dynamic of inclusion first and to make sure that we weren't just talking about diversity or sort of the count of who's represented in an organization or in the workforce, but also inclusion in terms of how people experience the workplace. What has evolved even since then is this concept of making sure we also have equity in the equation and in the conversation, so that it becomes diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the concept of equity really being that our identity is not predictive of our work outcomes, our professional outcomes, our professional opportunities. And so all three of those things working together as distinct concepts, but actually, quite related. And what we see in the data is the importance for each of those. The business case remains as compelling as it was 2 years ago, and the 2 years before that, and the 2 years before that. When we see organizations in top quartile with their top team on ethnic diversity, we see them likely to outperform their peers by 36% on EBIT basis and 25% when we look at it from a gender lens. We continue to see that when organizations outperform on both dimensions, they get even greater levels of performance returns. And so the business case continues to hold. But as we look at the dimensions around equity and inclusion, we see things like, employees more likely to stay, high potential and high performing employees significantly more likely to stay in their organizations where they perceive that opportunity and fairness are equitable. We see individuals unwilling to work for organizations that haven't actually made statements on dynamics of racial equity and equality. And interestingly, as you think about the continued war for talent, the intense need for innovation and more effective and efficient decision making in this exceptionally unprecedented and uncertain time, those elements of access to talent really matter. They always matter, but they matter disproportionately now. And when whole swaths of potential employees are unwilling to work in your organization because of how they perceive you on this dimension, it becomes not just, maybe a social moral issue, it becomes a talent issue. The other piece is just, as we look at millennials, as we look at consumers, the expectation that elements of diversity and inclusion are present in how organizations approach their corporate social responsibility or their ESG agendas is that much more prevalent. And so just this concept of license to operate it becomes even more pressing when you think about how consumers and potential employees look at companies around both equity and inclusion. So not only is the language changing a little bit, but the facts continue to evolve to reinforce the importance of this. If we look in this moment at what organizations are doing, what we see is a responsiveness to that requirement, both the business case, but also the talent and the consumer and the customer demand for it. And we see organizations really taking a two-pronged lens on their equity efforts. One is really sort of that internal lens. What will we do inside the proverbial four walls of our organization? And usually those are more aspirational efforts. How bold, big could we go? How do we do things that challenge what we previously thought possible? And then the other piece of it is really around that external lens. And this may be more part of the conversation than historically it has been. The idea that there is a responsibility outside of the proverbial four walls of the organization to lean forward. And what we see most organizations doing is really taking a capability forward approach, meaning what are the distinctive, unique, differentiated assets, skills, capabilities that we can offer on this particular topic to bring to the marketplace, whether that is, we have tremendous anti-bias training and resources, and we won't just do them for our employees, but we'll actually make them more available more publicly. Or we're going to commit shelf space to companies with diverse leadership and diverse products, or products aimed at diverse consumers, and because that's our unique asset, our shelf space. In this moment, I thought I might share an example that I'm deeply familiar with, which is McKinsey's own 10 actions and commitments to racial justice and equity. If you look at this, and there's a lot here, so I won't go through each of the different points, but the first 4 really are about what we will do internally inside of our organization, how we think about doubling our Black leadership, as well as our number of Black colleagues over the next 4 years, and being very intentionally aggressive about that plan. As we think about our own actions on inclusion and managing bias, our commitment to Day of Service, where we literally, we just had about a month ago, pencils down on the work that we do, and really focused on, in our communities, driving efforts for racial justice and trying to make a real difference, both in terms of how we come together as a firm, but also in the communities that we serve. The premise of all of this really is, in the sea of having a lot of dialogue of empathy and support and commitment to racial justice and equity, making that further move to action. And that's, as we frame the actions, both internally, what we want to do differently, but also as you look at kind of 5 through 10 externally. And I'll take, the 5th one. One of the things that McKinsey is genuinely world-class and distinctive at is building executive leaders, both in terms of how we build and shape our own internal talent, but also how we support our clients. And so we've taken one of those unique assets inside of our McKinsey Academy and created leadership programs that historically that have been, award-winning, well-renowned programs, but historically our clients would not have had a representative number of Black leaders participating, and we've made them available at no cost to our clients' Black leaders in the form of our Black Leadership Academy. If you take something like number 6, which is our Economic Institute for Black Economic Mobility, McKinsey is exceptional at digging into the facts, understanding the root cause driver, shining a light to prompt action. This is a place where we can dedicate resources to doing that around supporting economic mobility for Black citizens. And so it's just more of a flavor and an example of moving beyond kind of that basic diversity count into the further path of really taking action on these dimensions. I'll maybe just make 2 more points very quickly. One is just, what gets in the way of that action? Frequently, some of the points that we have here, I'd say two big things I'd really highlight. One is organizations not setting very specific goals around where they want to head on the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we get really uncomfortable with putting specific hard numbers on these topics. And so those organizations that are really succeeding have spent real time getting very crisp and measurable on what goals they actually have. The other piece I would say is, letting 1,000 flowers bloom. What tends to happen is organizations really say, okay, let's just have all the programs. But when those aren't intentional against a set of goals and really prioritized for what are the needs of the organization based on the impediments to Black talent and leaders being able, or any diverse talent and leaders being able to persist through the pipeline, typically you get a lot of expenditure of energy without a lot of return. So there's quite a bit that gets in the way. Organizations that sort of take the real time to set a clear vision, actually understand where they are with real facts, spend a real amount of time architecting a plan for where to go before they act, tend to have much greater success. What we tend to see getting in the way is, loose aspiration, let's start acting, and then it doesn't move the needle. And so there really is a process that it takes to successfully go down the path. So I'm going to stop there. I know we have lots of good discussion coming, but wanted to at least share some of those dimensions as we frame today's discussion.
Great. Sara, thank you so much. And I know Marianne will probably be coming on the screen shortly as well, or it might be she's there and I can't see her. Ah, there she is. Excellent. So again, so happy to have you both with us this morning. And my first question is going to go to Marianne. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the CEO action. I know you're a signatory on that and a member of the governing committee. So what made you sign up for the group and what can you share about it?
Well, thanks, Beth, and thank you very much for having me here. I think this is a great topic, and I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of this for sure. The CEO actions was something that I joined back in the fall, I guess, of 2019. And it really is a group of companies, signatories, that there's more than 1,400 companies that have actually joined. And the whole idea behind it is to really prevent bias and discrimination. It started, the coalition actually started in June of 2017. So it was very timely that it was around. And one of the things on the CEO action that they're requiring all companies that are part of this to really focus on is, one is making sure that you're fostering a cultural internally to really have diverse conversations so that you can talk about diversity and inclusion more openly in an organization. So the first thing is around conversations and having those open dialogues. The second piece is really an ability to learn from each other. More than 1,400 companies in this group gives us an opportunity to learn what other companies are doing. And it's also an opportunity for us to share some of the best practices that we're doing as well. And then the third piece was really around implementing unconscious bias training and making sure that employees in all of our organizations really understand the impact of unconscious bias. So those are sort of the three attributes that you needed to be a part of the signatory. The reason why I joined is I really wanted our workplace to be much more inclusive at John Hancock. I thought it was a real opportunity for us to learn from other organizations and an opportunity for us to be able to set an example for other businesses as well. We've been on a journey around sharing our humanity within our organization. That's sort of what we have coined it. And we've been working on this journey for a while now. And in February, Beth, you were actually at our Day of Understanding, and we certainly appreciated having you there. And it really that was sort of a convening moment for all of us at John Hancock, because it gave us an opportunity to really speak openly about race and the role that race plays both in work, home, and in society. So it was a really great opportunity for us to sort of venture on this journey. And following that, we've had a lot of conversations internally within the organizations. Some of those are tough conversations, and nobody ever really has the answer, but I think it's about having the dialogue and just trying to have that communication continuing to go on. And I know it's actually motivated me to get even more involved with the CEO actions. They've spun off another group, which is the CEO Action for Racial Equity. They did this in October. It really was done as a result of all of the things that were going on in the spring, and to really advance the racial issues that are out there. And I joined it, and really it's a fellowship program that are allowing all of the signatory companies that are involved to put forward an employee to actually help influence public policy. So it'll be really good to see what this organization can do. I'm on the steering committee. There's about 19 of us on the steering committee, and it really is to help move forward public policy. And we have one of our own employees actually that we have given to the fellowship for 2 years to be able to help to do that. So I think a great cause, and hopefully we will see some great action.
Great, thank you for sharing. One of the things you just talked about, Marianne, and you started out saying, was that it was really important to have dialogue within the organization. I hear from countless CEOs, what are the conditions that we need to have in place so those conversations can be successful? And I know we have something on our website to help people think about that. And Sara, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what are ways that organizations can successfully set up the environment to have conversations around DE&I, because you can't address something you can't talk about.
So as I heard Marianne say that, I was like, yes, that is really the most critical foundational element of this journey. And one of the pieces, we also have had a lot of clients and organizations struggling with how to do, because frequently you have the issue of it's an uncomfortable conversation. People are starting in vastly different places. And there's a high level of emotion that people are frequently really uncomfortable with, particularly in the workplace, that go with these conversations. And so I think a couple things have been really important. One is actually to establish a language in the organization around what is inclusive leadership, what is inclusive teaming, what does inclusion mean to us, what does equity mean to us, what does diversity mean, so that there is a starting place for folks that just don't actually have the right words. People are afraid to say Black or white or gay or woman or like whatever the word is, they're just afraid to say it. And so how do we have language that gives us a starting place? And so that's real. And then creating spaces for that. I think, beyond that, more tactically, organizations have done quite a bit with actually getting leaders to commit to certain time and space as safe discussion for the topic. So the charge to different people, leaders, to have a conversation with their direct reports and to create that open environment. And that if they need a coach or they need someone to help support the conversation because they don't feel comfortable managing themselves, to do that. And then establishing real norms around, presuming good intent, around being able to respond to the idea without attacking the person, those types of dialogue. But I think the most important thing is actually to create the expectation of leaders that it's unacceptable to not have the conversation.
And Marianne, anything to add, lessons that you learned in being able to have these conversations at John Hancock?
Yeah, and I think the biggest lessons are that it's not easy. As Sara said, having these open conversations and dialogues isn't easy. And it's interesting. I think a lot of times people lower in the organization look up to the senior leaders and think they always have the answers. And when it comes to this, we certainly don't have the answers. But it is a matter of just having those open conversations and making sure that people feel comfortable and expressing opinions one way or the other, and just having those dialogues. I think that is the hardest part. It really is the conversations.
Yeah. And something, Marianne, that you just mentioned, that leaders don't always have the answer. And I think I certainly know, as somebody that runs an organization, that's difficult, right? To not think that you have the answer. So what words can you give to encourage leaders to be able to be vulnerable about that? So you have done that to be successful in your efforts. So I would just, any words of encouragement for people to be able to be vulnerable like that as a leader.
Yeah, and I think just being very transparent, it's really hard as a leader, as you say, not having all the answers. People look up to you and expect you to have all the answers. But I just am transparent, and I often say to people, I'm not always sure the right things to say, and I don't want to say something wrong, but that shouldn't stop me from talking about issues. And I think that's one thing we have to encourage people about, is don't get too hung up in, what if I say something wrong? What if I don't do the right thing? Or what if I've insulted someone, or I've caused them some pain? And my response is, well, then we just apologize and say that, we're sorry that wasn't our intention, and move on. And it's those open dialogues that are hard. And I think it's even harder to get people to talk because they are fearful of what they might say. And I wouldn't say that anybody's doing anything from a negative perspective. They're coming from the right spot, but we always don't know how people will react to some of the things we say. So just keeping that safety there and making sure that people understand not to be afraid to speak up. And if we say something wrong, we'll say
I'll
sorry.
add, one of the things that we have also found helpful, as Sara talked a little bit about providing definition and also talking about systems. I think often people If we talk about a system that, white supremacy as a system or systemic racism, then people take that personally, saying you're calling them a white supremacist or you're calling them a racist. And getting people to understand that this is a system that we all participate in, I think can sometimes be helpful as well for people not to think that someone's calling them a name or they're a bad person, but thinking about the system. Sara, I want to ask you, you raised some work that McKinsey's doing to try to move their efforts forward. I think there were 10 steps. What can organizations do to ensure that there's momentum and that can be sustained if leadership changes?
So that's a tough one. We could sit here for a couple hours on that one. But a few things. So it is, there's a couple things I think that are true in this, which is, this is a moment where organizations are leaning in and they're saying something. And that is great. But for a true different outcome, they actually have to do the things that they're saying, and potentially even beyond what they're comfortable doing, right? There's a lot of discomfort in this, particularly when you're making a commitment specifically on racial justice and equity. And if you're specifically focusing on Black people, right? Others are sort of saying, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? And so there's all sorts of things that are fraught with, that are challenging to the journey right now. I think what has been true for organizations that I've seen really execute with success, and I don't know if you have a lot of background noise from me, hopefully. I can't tell if it's, I'm just gonna, okay, is that better? All right, I think that's better. Okay, I think what has, organizations that have been able to make real movement here, a couple things. One is they've actually dedicated real organizational capacity to executing against their actions or their commitments. So for example, internally, we spun up a team literally dedicated to moving to action on the different efforts. And then we actually put the responsibility and accountability in the parts of the business where it is their normal work to do. So if they are client-facing things, we sat that work with client-facing leaders. If it were internal people process-oriented things, we sat it there, but then we brought operational leaders to be also accountable for the work with them. And one of the things we were very intentional about doing is not making full accountability on the shoulders of diverse individuals themselves, because there's a lot of water that's already carried on that dimension. And so asking the folks that are already paying that incremental activity to be the only shoulders of that are carrying this work is really ineffective. And then the other piece is you truly do have to bring the whole organization along. Like, it has to be as compelling a commitment as any other strategic lever or initiative in the organization, and resourced accordingly. I mean, again, I'm giving a very high level. We really could talk about this one for hours and unpack where to go. But you have to have specific metrics against each one. You have to have real dedicated resources to drive it, and it has to be on par with other strategic initiatives, and you can't put it on the shoulders of the diverse individuals themselves only to lead it. By the way, you also can't go off and do it without diverse individuals having input, because then you'll get it wrong. So there is a careful balance there, but those are at least the cornerstones of it.
Great, thank you. And Marianne, what thoughts do you have for building this as into the DNA of your organization?
Yeah, well, we talked about having those courageous conversations, and that's just step one. You really do have to take action, and that's exactly what Sara's saying. And so we've done a number of things internally, making sure we have diverse candidate slates, making sure that there's no bias actually in our job descriptions as they go out. So really starting to focus on our hiring and our talent coming in. I have hired DEI officer. Gwen McCoy has joined our organization in October, and she's really helping us to spearhead a lot of these initiatives. And Sara's right, you really do have to push it down in the organization. It can't be just with a head of DEI. That's not going to work. It really has to be reflective all through the organization. And that's why we've got it in the talent acquisition side. We also have it in terms of looking at our employees. The next sort of phase, and Gwen's going to help with this, is how do you develop the people that you have? So it's great to focus on the hiring and making sure that we have diverse candidates coming into the organization. And I think that's really, really important. But there are a lot of great people that we already have within the organization. So how do we have development programs for those people to be able to help them, whether it's a mentor program or a coaching program where they have people that are actually sponsoring them and helping them through the organization. So those are some of the things that we're doing. We also have the ability of being part of a global organization as well. And so we can really leverage our other geographies. We're in Canada and we're in Asia as well. Leverage our other geographies just to get different perspectives in terms of some of the challenges that they face, what works, what doesn't work. And as an organization, we've actually committed $3.5 million over the next 2 years. And it really is about training, making sure that we're training our employees to watch out for bias. And it's beyond unconscious bias even. And it's just making sure that they have the training that they need to be able to manage people. As Sara said, managers have to talk to their employees and they have to be able to do that. Another big piece of it too is around making sure that we have targets that we're going after. It's one of those things, you hate to say it, but especially in financial services, what gets measured gets done. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we're setting targets for ourselves and making sure that we hold true to a lot of that. So it's really been a bit of a journey of a lot of different things that we've been working on.
Great. You raised something just as you were ending around targets. And so I was in a conversation yesterday with a group of CEOs, and one of them raised the question around having financial compensation for some of these goals, and particularly around hiring goals. And his concern was that if his organization had goals for hiring more women and people of color, that people would question those hires because it's tied to compensation. And so I was wondering if both you, Marianne, and Sara could talk about your perspectives on tying compensation to goals related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and particularly around hiring goals.
So I'm happy to go first. Yeah, I think you do have to be careful because you want to make sure you get the right behavior. There's nothing worse than putting in some targets, making it tied to a person's individual compensation, and them just trying to hire as many women or people of color as they can, whether they're the right people or not. I'm fairly sensitive to this as a woman. I've always said that I want to make sure that I got to my spot based on my contributions to the organization, not based on the fact that I'm a woman. And I think that, there is that balance. By the same token, I think that a lot of times, a little bit like I said earlier, what gets measured gets done. Sort of the same thing applies on the compensation side, that if you don't put it into compensation, sometimes that you don't get the impacts that you want. So I think there's a balance that's there. I do think that people need to be held accountable, and we need to do our part to make sure that we can actually do a better job at getting more diverse candidates within the organization. As our organization has focused on gender for a number of years, and it is part of our compensation in terms of making sure that we get to those levels. And I expect the exact same is happening right now as we talk through next year in some of those BIPOC targets that we're setting, is that it does need to be tied to compensation in order to see the action happen.
And maybe a couple of thoughts that I would add is, and I'm probably on the bolder end of the push of this spectrum than probably most folks would be comfortable with. But, I'll say a couple things. What Marianne said is absolutely right. If you don't measure and inspect and hold folks accountable and tie it to their compensation, either monetarily or in other ways with recognition and reward, you actually don't create the focus. And you would never ask the question around a normal, like, hey, we want to sell more of this product, and therefore, we're going to get people to tie their compensation, we're going to tie people's compensation to selling more of that product. You would never say, oh, those sales aren't as good as the other sales. You just wouldn't question it. And it is in the world in which this is a strategic business imperative, what are we questioning? I think what you're actually questioning is your hiring process, which says that we can make poor choices and have bad behaviors in the process, as opposed, because if your bar is your bar is your bar, and you are sweeping the talent pools for the talent, then the question of the caliber of person you're bringing in isn't a question, because your bar is your bar is your bar, right? But if that's not true, then you could question the caliber of talent, because there's all sorts of unintended behaviors that might come as a consequence of that. So I think my push to that concern would be, okay, we'll go revisit your talent process to make sure the bar is the right bar, and then you don't actually have that concern. Then you're just focusing on measuring a strategic imperative and making sure it actually happens.
And so I'm going to ask you a related question, Sara. There's often pushback that organizations get in saying, well, if you're going to put in special programs for people of color or for women or any other group, what about me? Like, you're leaving me out. Isn't this reverse discrimination? So what do you say to that?
Oh, why do you have to ask me that question?
Because I can't wait to hear your response.
I'm glad she asked you and not me, Sara.
Let's start with almost any organization in corporate America. The statistical likelihood of me being a senior leader of that organization as a Black female is about 0%. And so when we start with that fact, it gets very difficult for me to productively have a conversation about programs put in place to counterbalance that. The whole concept of equity is that my identity doesn't define my professional outcomes and opportunities. And the fact of the matter is that the data today would tell you that's not the case, that my identity does in fact determine my likelihood of progression. And so doing things to counterbalance that has nothing to do with taking away from other communities or other individuals, and has everything to do with disrupting. You talked about the systemic pieces, but disrupting the systemic pieces that are in place that create the inequity. And so I have relatively limited energy for the dialogue that says, by ensuring that I am equitably sponsored, it takes away from someone who will be more than equitably sponsored by nature of their existing identity. So I will leave it at that.
Marianne, anything to add? Because I would imagine in your role, you have gotten some of this pushback from employees.
I've gotten a little, not too much. I like Sara's response, so maybe we should just leave it at that.
We can.
I'm just kidding. She did a great job, but I think you have to be aware. I also agree with Sara that the numbers are so small in terms of the people that you have in senior management at certain levels of color, that the balance, she's right, it's not even remotely the same. But I always say that you do have to balance this. We have a number of ERGs, and you hear these comments around, why are we so focused on people of color or women or LGBTQ? But my view is anybody can be a part of those groups. It's not just those individuals. And I think it is important that we do have more and more. As a matter of fact, I think are getting up to quite a significant number of ERGs within our organization. And I'm encouraging people that if there's a cause that you have, you should formulate the group and get together. And I think that is an opportunity where people can have these dialogues. And I think it's important to make sure that as an organization, we support the ERGs as much as possible. We just recently added a couple more extra ones. Believe it or not, we just added one recently, or in the about to, around parenting and, trying to deal with parenting challenges. So people have an opportunity to get together and talk about it, especially during the pandemic, when people that are working from home and trying to balance looking after the kids at the same time can have forums to have those conversations. So I really think the ERG forums are a great opportunity for us to have more of that.
And Sara, I see you nodding on the ERGs or employee resource groups. Do you have thoughts on that you wanted to share?
Oh, I thought the point, Marianne, that you were making around, actually, there was 2 points. I think one was, maybe tied back to your original question. The reality is when an organization builds inclusive muscles for any particular group, and that becomes more of the embedded culture of the organization, it actually does benefit everyone, regardless of whether you would be an underrepresented minority in that particular organization or not. An inclusive culture is a positive thing, and if you even look at non-diverse individuals themselves, they will stay in organizations longer that are more inclusive. So a special program to help me, but also that builds inclusion for the organization, actually in and of itself is beneficial to the broader organization. And I think ERGs, or employee resource groups, are a great example of that, and the fact that they actually aren't exclusive. In most organizations, anyone of any identity can join an ERG. Like, for example, if in McKinsey we have our McKinsey Black Network, it's actually from its inception 20 years ago has been open to every single person in the firm. You just have to choose to be a part of it. And I do think that it creates the opportunity for if people want to participate in those programs in that way, they can go join the ERG and participate in the programs in that way. So I thought that was a really important point that Marianne was making, which is, for the most part, ERGs are not exclusive and are quite inclusive. And so they just provide a broader foundation really for everyone to benefit from the programs.
Great. And we were talking at one point earlier too about training. And so I wanted to get this question out on the table, since the current administration has, said that you can't do certain types of training, and wanted to know, Sara, have you seen this impacting any of your clients? And Marianne, has this come up with any of your staff about we shouldn't do this training anymore because the federal government says we should not? And I will just share from the data that we have at YWCA, from the trainings that we've done, these trainings have actually made organizations more cohesive, and that once people have a better understanding of systemic racism, that more staff at all levels feel comfortable advocating for equitable policies internally. So, the downside has not been shown in any of our data. And I'd love to hear just thoughts on what you've been seeing and hearing, and how organizations can still continue this work.
So one of our commitments was number 5, and we've begun our Black Leadership Academy as a result of that action. And the interesting thing is, as we were going out talking about it, one of the first questions we were getting from organizations that wanted to send Black leaders to these amazing executive development programs, but had that concern in their minds was, gosh, we don't know if we can participate now, and this is a disappointing missed opportunity, or can we participate? Does it fit? Like, how do we think about this? And maybe the thing that I would say is, when you look at programs that focus on helping leaders be more inclusive leaders, ignore sort of executive development for specific groups, but just look at programs that help leaders become more inclusive leaders. The underpinnings of them, it's not something magic and unknown. It's actually just good leadership stuff, right? I mean, we were talking earlier about the vulnerability of being able to say, hey, I don't really know, all the right words to say here, but I'm trying to engage us in a conversation so I understand the context of the people that I'm leading or that I'm working with. Like, that's not a race thing or a gender thing or a sexual identity and orientation thing. That's actually just good leadership. And so, at least in my mind, as organizations have been struggling with the question, I think that the cost has been, do we just miss opportunities to further expand the effectiveness of our leadership period, and therefore grow our organizations, and therefore grow the financial well-being of our communities? And to me, I think that's the challenge, because Beth, I would see the same thing as you, which is, the programs, like, there's not a negative impact of the programs, they're certainly quite positive. So
I was just going to say, from my perspective, Beth, I think you know my view on training. You know, it started with our Day of Understanding in February, and then we worked with YW very closely on the social identities workshop, and then doing the Inclusion Boston. I think the training is really important. I don't think we can go on this journey around diversity, equity, and inclusion without the training from an employee perspective, because there's just such an unknown. It was interesting. We had an open dialogue, digress for a minute, in early January with some of our employees, and there was a particular issue that came up, and there was a white person in the audience that said, "Help me understand. I really want to understand why you viewed this from a negative perspective." And I think those open dialogues, those trainings, really help us to be able to address those kinds of questions. People want to know when things aren't right, and how do we make it right, and the training is really what gets us there. I agree with Sara. It's just sort of basic leadership that's really important. When we heard the comment from the federal government about no training, we kind of looked at that and thought that's ridiculous, you know, especially in today's environment, after everything that happened in the springtime and George Floyd and all those issues around racial injustice. Now more than ever, we need the training. And you know, sort of, it didn't stop us whatsoever from continuing on our programs. And I think it's really important that companies do continue down that path.
And one of the things, Marianne, that I wanted to come back to is you're doing tremendous work internally. And part of that, though, is you had to establish a baseline, right? To figure out where are we and where do we want to go? And that's also what Sara showed in her slides, that you need to do an assessment to figure out where you are. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, the efforts that the organization took to establish a baseline and any challenges you encountered in doing that?
Sure. Actually, that was probably one of the more challenging things that we have done, believe it or not. You wouldn't think that would be. In July, we actually opened up to all employees saying, please go into our Workday, which is our HR system, and self-identify. We worked with our employee resource groups to make sure that we had all the language correct, so that we were addressing things like gender and sexual orientation and race, and making sure that we had a number of different ways that people could self-identify. We opened it up in July, and interestingly enough, our Black population really struggled with it and was really uncomfortable about us wanting to gather this baseline information. And I expressed that the whole purpose is to have the baseline as we set targets. It will help us make sure that, you know, we understand where we've come from, where we want to go, and making sure that we're making progress around that as well. But a number of our employees were very nervous about it. And they said, well, we're not sure what you're going to use the information for. You know, does that mean that I'm the first one on a layoff list if you're going to lay off? And I was really surprised by that, because I said quite the opposite from that. You know, it really is an opportunity for us to identify our population and make sure we can help people, mentor them, develop them accordingly. And I ended up, as you get to know me, I'm very transparent in terms of how I work. And as soon as I heard rumblings that people were feeling uncomfortable about this, I said, well, let's have a town hall and let's talk about it. Let's open it up and talk about it. And we invited two of our employee resource group leaders, one that manages Vibe, which is for our Black employees and beyond, because it is open to everybody in the organization. And the other one was for our multicultural professionals. And both of those two leaders spoke to all the employees, as I did as well, just talking about the importance of making sure that we have that baseline. That baseline is absolutely critical. And it did help, but I have to admit, I was really surprised by the reaction that we got and the hesitancy that it created.
For some, in addition to the forum, were there other things that you did to try to strengthen trust, particularly with Black employees? And then Sara, I'll ask you to talk about, are there things that organizations can be mindful of in trying to make sure they're developing trust within different employee groups?
I'd say the biggest thing on the trust side was having the dialogue and giving them the opportunity to ask questions, and anything that was on their mind, to be able to get them more comfortable. Also, hearing from other people of color, I think, really helps as well, and helped our employees sort of get their head around it and understand, because it's not just from senior management. Sometimes people are very skeptical about what senior management's up to. And so I think having their peers talking was really helpful as well. So again, it's that opportunity for people to ask questions and to probe and really understand. And that's really, to me, what a lot of it is about, is making sure they understand the why we're doing things as well.
I would maybe, I think that's right. It's interesting because I was surprised when we, even just for us with our 10 actions, when we put them forward, I was surprised by some of the follow-up conversations with other Black colleagues that there's like certain things, there was a lot of suspicion or actually negative reaction to some of the elements, even though we'd had lots of dialogue leading up to creating them. And what I found ultimately was two things. One, which, or maybe three things. One with which Marianne said, which is just the creating the forums for dialogue and being mindful actually about who's in what forums. Like, at what points do you have forums where people feel like, hey, we're in the tent and we're able to say like the things that we won't say out loud to everybody else? And when do you actually have a mixed group so that the tent gets a little bigger and we're actually having those open, honest dialogues more broadly, and the blend between those? And you think about that from, you know, seniority in the organization levels, but also identity, like who's in and who's not in that same identity level. So that's one. I think the second is transparency. And really the ability, the piece that has been, not just in our organization, but across, I've at this point had hundreds of conversations with different organizations about this. And what has been universally true is we really want to know, like what's the actual thing, the facts behind the commitment, what's the progress that's being made on that, you know, why are we saying what we're saying, like and so that requires the conversation not to be just those open initial forums, but to be ongoing and responsive to, here's what we said we were going to do, here's what we've done, or here's what we said we were going to do. We can't be transparent against this because it violates employee laws or whatever the case may be. But just that true transparency, I think, is the other one. And then I think the last is a bit of seeing leaders be committed to educating themselves. It can't fall fully to the diverse communities to share their pain and share their stress and share their issues in order to bring leaders along. I think leaders visibly actually educating themselves and building their own knowledge and creating their own experiences so that they have empathy has also been another element.
Thank you both for sharing that. And I will say one of the things with our Inclusion Boston program that I think one of the secret sauce to that is the empathy that develops across participants in the group. Because you don't always know somebody's experience, even if you've worked with them for a decade, right? You don't know necessarily what it is to live in their shoes until you're in an environment where they feel comfortable sharing that. And most people, when they hear what their peers might be facing, both externally and internally, they understand when things are wrong and they want to see things change. And if they can help the organization make a difference, they will. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, put them please in the chat. And I think that's what I'm going to be monitoring. You can also throw them in the Q&A and I'll look in the Q&A as well. Oh, I see some questions in the Q&A, so let me go there. What's the first one here? You would think I would know how to make something go up and down. Okay, how should leaders respond to colleagues for immediate action while moving through the essential planning phase Sara described? I think that's a great question. There's always this sense of urgency, and how do you balance that? So Sara, if you could respond, and then Marianne, I'd love for you to comment on how you were able to do that at John Hancock.
Yeah, so it's a real challenge, and I will, it's a tangible thing, right? The reality is many times the sort of truly progressive, transformative goals that organizations are seeking falter because they don't spend the time on the planning. but there are a series of no regrets things that can start to happen. And one of those are these open conversations. Another one is, how do we start to create a language for how we have these conversations and taking action on that? And then the transparency in the organization which is, we are committed to this. We're putting the blocks in place so that this is a sustained effort, not a flash in the pan, because that's another risk of this moment. And so I think those things help to feel like things are happening while the planning is happening. And then the other point is, usually there's something in the different elements that can go faster, right? So we have 10 commitments. Not all of them are equally progressed, but half of them have real tangible things that have happened that help the momentum build and continue to go. And so typically you're looking for one or two things you can go ahead and get moving on. And they shouldn't be things that are so definitive that once you get the data, if you learn a different direction, you can't course correct. But language and dialogues and a day of service or a day of understanding, like those types of things won't unwind the grand plan and will have real momentum and help.
Yeah, and I'll give you sort of real life example of what we did at John Hancock, because I had my DEI officer actually had moved on to a bigger opportunity, which was great for her, but it left me with a hole. And that was at the early part of this year, at the beginning of 2020. And then, of course, when everything started to happen around the communities and the social injustice that was happening, there was more of a demand for let's move fast. We were obviously trying to recruit someone, but it's not easy to recruit. And I think it's making sure you get the right person that's going to fit into the culture of the organization as well. But when a lot of this happened, we did move very quickly, as Beth knows, to engaging YW to help us have those conversations. We started before a lot of that happened in February with the Day of Understanding, but once really the George Floyd happened, it was a great opportunity for us to bring YW in and just talk about, what does this mean? What's going on in sort of society? Where does this come from? So those, again, I know Sara and I are saying very similar things, but the sort of the immediate thing that you can do is start the dialogue. But you have to be careful that you don't rush. We didn't rush on our hiring of our DEI officer. We wanted to make sure we got the right person, and I'm super excited to have Gwen on board. And she's really going to help lay out a plan, but you do have to take the time to make sure that you're laying out the plan. It doesn't mean, however, that you have to stop everything and wait until you have some strategic plan ready to go. And that's where these sessions that we've been doing with YW has been very helpful in terms of bridging some of that gap as we have our more strategic plan laid out.
Yeah, and I'll also add, I think it is extraordinarily important for people to remember that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. Mm-hmm. And so we're so used to sort of immediate gratification and getting things done. This system, the system of slavery and oppression has been in place for over 400 years. It's not going to be resolved in 4 days. And so I think it's important for leaders to remember that, and also for employees to think about, as Sara said, what can be short-term things where we can get some wins immediately. But remember, this is a long-term game. So we've got to build out a plan that can be sustainable regardless of changes in the organization, that will really move us forward, because we've got to undo lots of things that we've been doing within our organizations. Another question was, how do you decide on language? And how do you do that in a way that's inclusive, and who gets to determine what's the terminology that's going to be used within an organization? I'll open it up to either or both of you for that.
So we've both been doing this ourselves, but also helping other organizations do it. So it's an interesting thing, because you need the organization to accept and embrace the language, but deciding language by a group of 10,000 people or 500 people is a difficult thing to do. So what we've seen be most effective is to have a small group of diverse folks from different levels of the organization and different operating units of the organization, usually spearheaded by the DEI function, or in our world we actually have an organization practice, and so but by a group that has domain knowledge, to create it, and then spend time testing it at, front line of the organization, most senior levels, refining it, and then using it and starting to train. There's not going to be 100% acceptance of anything. And so at some point, you just actually need enough influential folks in the organization to start talking in that way. It needs to filter into how you have performance conversations and so on and so forth, and then it becomes adopted.
I would say the very similar things to what Sara just said. We use a lot of times our employee resource groups to help us in terms of the language and just making sure that we are saying things right and using the right terms. I do want to come back to something, Sara, you said earlier in the session, and it's around the labels too. And I get nervous too when we have to really watch the language that we don't create labels, and labels start to get used more generically. So I think we do have to be really cautious around it. And certainly my Gwen, my DEI head, is going to be very instrumental in doing that. So very similar to what Sara as well.
Yeah. And so what are ways, Marianne, you've talked about having these conversations internally. Sara, you've talked about that as well. And a question is, what are effective strategies to have conversations around race, ethnicity in a Zoom environment? Sometimes people think it's easier when you're in person as opposed to Zoom. So what are some things that organizations should be putting in place so that you can talk effectively via Zoom?
I certainly think that it is much easier to do it face-to-face. I think Zoom makes it a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. We've had some great sessions, and it's been very helpful. And I think the key is sort of setting the stage with the whole group and having things like we have here, even with the tables and small breakout groups. That's really critical. You have to get down to smaller numbers where people can feel more comfortable having that dialogue. So I think if you start getting into groups of anything more than 4, you're probably getting into too many. So I would suggest that you have the technology to be able to break down those groups and move people into smaller groups to have some dialogue and then come back into the center. That's worked well with the YW presentations that we have had as well. And I just think that those smaller conversations makes it less intimidating versus in a much broader group, even on Zoom. Same would apply, by the way, in person. It's the same kind of issue. If you're in a much bigger group, people will be much more hesitant. And I think always having the breakout opportunity is a good way for people to carry on the dialogue.
The only 2 things that I would add is, in a few instances, well, not in a few, in many instances, we've prompted folks to speak or be ready to speak up in advance, right? So that someone starts the conversation, because sometimes in the flatter format of Zoom, you just don't have the body language to know that someone's jumping in. And so getting someone prepped. I think the other piece is I've seen a lot of effectiveness with creating some sort of shared fact language prompt that gives people something to react to. So it's not just the raw sharing of where are you today?
Right. Yeah. And I will say one of the things that we do, aside from having people in smaller groups, is also thinking about what is the frame of the conversation so that people can find different ways to enter. And also doing things so that maybe you're doing things with a Padlet, right? You're doing some writing and not just always talking. So thinking about how adults learn too. Another question that came up is one of the challenges that heads of diversity often face is that they have no power or resources. So how do you talk to leadership in an organization to make sure that if somebody has the title of head of DEI, they have resources to support their efforts?
I think that's a really good point. When I was doing the hiring of our DEI person, that was one of the decisions too, is in terms of where should that person sit, because the last DEI individual reported into our HR person who reported into me. In this situation, I said I wanted the DEI person reporting directly into me so that they do have that power, and they do understand, employees do understand how important it is to us as an organization that Gwen is sitting on my leadership table and part of all of the strategic discussions, where we're going, what we need to do. And she always knows and is very integrated into everything that we're doing. So I think that's a really important piece in terms of where they sit in the organization. You have to give them that sort of, elevate them within the organization, and they need to be part of the leadership team, as far as I'm concerned, to really be impactful. And that does give them more, certainly more power as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And I think the other piece is really positioning their work as actually equipping the leadership team to do their work, meaning that it's not the DEI person's responsibility to do the work of DEI in the organization. They're actually in place to equip all the other leaders to do the work of talent and strategy that the business has to do in order to be successful. I think it's really important to have that positioning, because then it becomes not about this thing over on the side or this functional silo. It really becomes how we are driving growth and value and impact in our organization.
That's both great points. And I'll also add, it's around the resources. I think for any strategic initiative within an organization, there is usually funding to support it. And that's the same if this is a part of your strategy, there should be funding to support it. And it shouldn't be seen as just an administrative role. But if this is important, we fund it, right? We provide it with the funding and the people that it needs. We don't have an unfunded mandate, but everything else, all the other strategies have, people and resources. Another question that came up is, if DEI is a core value in your organization, are there metrics you can use when evaluating potential hires on how they fit into this mindset or this kind of culture?
That's a good question. And I think part of it is making sure that the people in your talent organization understand how to ask the questions to the individuals, just to make sure that, I think a lot of times our talent people are out there making sure that these individuals are good fits in the organization for multiple reasons, right? To fit into the culture, and really making sure the talent people as well have been educated in terms of what makes a good candidate and what will help us further along our DEI agenda versus where we might have been before. And that's why I keep harping on the training, but I think the training is so important for everyone, even on your recruiters. They've got to make sure that they're trained and know what they should be looking for as well at the same time.
Yeah. I don't think there's a single kind of metric or test or evaluation, right? I don't think this is a sort of a place where you might say, oh, let's use the implicit bias test or something like that in that dimension. I do think it goes back to this work of what does inclusive leadership and inclusive teaming mean in our organization? What are the characteristics? How does it show up in our culture? And then making sure part of your interview conversation and your hiring process allows you to, get examples of how that person has done on those dimensions in the past or how they think about those dimensions. But it actually is less about a particular metric or measure and more actually about an organization having clarity themselves about what that means in their culture so that they can ask the right questions, as Marianne was highlighting.
Okay. Another question, and this we've heard often, is my organization does a lot of trainings around DE&I, but the same people show up all the time, and there are a bunch of folks that never show up. What do we do?
Well, I'll tell you what we did more recently when we did the Inclusion Boston is we actually picked the candidates that were going to go. And part of picking the candidates was to get a diverse group of individuals that were part of it, and to get people that would be influencers within the organization and be able to talk more about some of the things that they've learned and passed along some of that information to others. So I think it really is reaching into the organization, and whether you have to gently nudge or force upon. In our situation, these were all hypo people, so people that we think really strongly of, that we really believe can deliver the messages. within the organization. So it was a great opportunity to have a diverse candidate slate, so that it isn't only just people of color, that we do have a diverse group of people that are attending the training. And I think we just have to be more conscious of that as we continue on our training, to make sure that it isn't always the same people raising their hands, because you will run into that very quickly.
Sara, have you seen strategies that organizations have used to encourage those that that don't attend, to get them to show up occasionally?
Yeah, when you share who's showing up and you create a little bit of competition internally, it usually changes behaviors very interestingly. So I think, and I say, I'm not meaning that glibly, it sounds glib, but I mean, literally, if it's a priority and you make it transparent of who's showing up where and how, I do think you actually get a lot of shifting of priorities and people making more time.
Right. And I'll also add, I think if it is considered a competency within the organization, and one that would allow you to advance, that being able to demonstrate that, going to the training helps to demonstrate that that is a competency that you're learning about. So positioning yourself to advance within the organization. So I do think it's also important for how organizations talk about the importance of that in one's ability to advance internally. So we've got a couple of more minutes. I think we've gone through many of the questions. If you have other questions, please send them our way. I think we've got a minute or two. Before we end, though, I do want to give Marianne and Sara both an opportunity. Is there something that inspiration that you could give somebody listening to this webinar today to say to help them continue on this journey?
So it's a tough question, which is, hey, on the spot, be inspiring. But what I will say is maybe less about me being inspiring and more about what I'm inspired by, which is I've obviously been thinking about this probably my whole life, right? You can go back to being in 3rd grade and my teacher won't call on me because I'm the only Black child in the class. And for whatever reason, I guess she didn't believe I would have the answer. All the way to the fact that, over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been doing this work fairly deeply. And it's a different moment, at least for me, in sort of that continuum of, of time. And I think that we have intention and focus and a provocation, particularly from younger generations, in a way that we haven't. And so I feel encouraged that this isn't a flash in the pan, and that organizations are embedding and putting in place not just commitments to equity, but infrastructure and resourcing. And so my encouragement is for those that understand the criticality of this and the success of their organizations going forward, to embrace the moment and to try to help their organizations push so far ahead on the commitment that there is no going back, right? When I think about what we've done with the Black Leadership Academy, we have to deliver. There's no way not that we would, but there's no way to walk back from that commitment. And so I just encourage people to use this moment to push so far, so uncomfortably ahead, that there's no way to walk back.
Hey, Marianne, you get the last word.
Well, I would say it's put yourself out there. And I say that in terms of have those difficult conversations. People of color that are out there, make sure you have those conversations. Don't be afraid to talk about, some of the challenges that you face and what needs to be done differently. People not of color, you should be engaging in these conversations just as much. It's so important that we build a culture where we're all talking about it and that we're all working together for the same end. And I agree with Sara, let's push hard so that there's no turning back. Let's really make a difference in the short term so that we don't worry in 20 or 30 years from now that we're sitting in the exact same spot that we were sitting in 2020. We want to be in a different spot. And so let's all engage in this and push forward.
Excellent. Well, our program has ended, but hopefully the work of furthering DE&I in your organizations will continue. Please do not hesitate to reach out to Sara Bornstein at YWCA if you need support living out your organization's intentions around DE&I. Again, I want to thank Marianne and Sara, our fabulous speakers this morning. They were terrific. I know I walked away with a lot of learnings. I'm sure you all have as well. I want to thank all our sponsors. And again, I want to thank you all for attending. This has been terrific. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful holiday season as well. Thanks so much.